Hi everybody, and welcome back to NorCal Slot Car Scene. In Northern California, we've begun racing the Can-Am class again. A few months ago, I did a video on my build of the MR Slot Car Shadow, which resulted in a victory on the car's debut. My latest Can-Am build is based around the newest livery that Thunderslot has put out for the McLaren M6. I'll be starting with the same basic build as the McLaren that won the first Electric Dreams Can-Am last year. Last year's McLaren is still very competitive in the Can-Am class. The goal, obviously, is to build a better, faster Can-Am car. First, let's take a look at the components we're going to use in our new McLaren. The starting point of this build will be the dark gray stiff chassis. This chassis is harder than the gray chassis that I used in the previous McLaren build, and is the stiffest of the three that Thunderslot makes. The motor pod will be the gray, hard motor pod from Thunderslot, and it's the same as I used on last year's McLaren. I'm going to be replacing or adding quite a few components to this build, including the guide, adding ballast, the pinion and spur gears, and the motor. The guides that I prefer are from Slot Invasion. They work extremely well on the tracks where I race. However, they can be a bit wide for some tracks. A good alternative would be the Thunderslot wood guide, the NSR wood guide, or even the stock guide works fine. For ballast, instead of lead, I'm going to use tungsten bars. The tungsten bars are made by Slot-It. They weigh about 2.5 grams each, and they fit very well into the motor pod. When you put them in the motor pod, you'll notice there's a little bit of slop, so you may have to add a little bit of tape to reduce the movement, or just use silicone adhesive to attach them, especially if the rules for your club don't allow movable ballast. Once you have them installed, you notice they make a much cleaner installation than using lead, and they do lower the center of gravity just slightly. I really like the Slotting Plus set screw pinions because it gives you the versatility to move the gear in and out without having to use a gear puller or a gear press. The stock pinion has 11 teeth, and that's what I'm using here. I'll be using the stock 32 tooth spur gear as a starting point, but I'll also have a 30 tooth, a 31 tooth, and a 33 tooth from NSR to aid in the motor tuning. This will give me the flexibility of having gear ratios from 2.73 to 1 all the way up to 3.0 to 1. When I raced the car at Electric Dreams, we were required to use a spec motor, the NSR 21.5K. Our Northern California rules, however, allow motors up to 25K. And I've been using the Predator 25K with great results. I had planned to use another one in this car, but I recently saw that Predator has released a new 25K ball bearing motor. So that's what's going in this new Thunderslot McLaren. To complete the build, there are quite a few other little things that I've done to the car. First of all, as with any car, you need to screw the motor into the motor pod. For this, I'm using Slotting Plus 2mm by 4mm Torx head screws. The guide is held in place with a Slot-It chamfered brass screw. And with all of my cars, I'm using the Slot-It soft racing braid. I kept the stock wire to transmit the power to the motor, and I used silicone adhesive to attach the lead wire to the chassis. The front tires were glued to the wheels and trued just enough so they're round. They were then set so they just touched the track with the car on a setup block. I've raced my Group 5 car at other tracks, and at Glen Canyon Raceway, it required about 20 thousandths worth of spacers under the guide, so that's where I started with the McLaren. I tried a couple of the different gear ratios you saw earlier, but when it came right down to it, the stock 11:32 seemed to be the best ratio for this track. When I ran the car on the track, it seemed like it wanted a little bit more weight in the rear, so I added a tungsten rod just in front of the motor. The tungsten rod weighed about the same as each tungsten bar, so I had a total of 7.5 grams of ballast on the motor pod. I also added about 1.2 grams of lead right behind the guide. I also added strapping tape on the bottom of the chassis. This seems to tighten the car up just a little bit and make it easier to drive. I tried a number of different tire compounds, including NSR Ultra Grip and Super Grip. I settled on running Slot-It G25 compound tires. The tires were mounted on the stock Thunderslot wheels that have 3 ribs. The third rib seems to give more support across the surface of the tire. and acts somewhat like an insert. When you mount the body of Thunderslot McLaren to the chassis, make sure you use the correct length screw. If the screw is too long, this is what will happen. I know from experience from the previous McLaren build. I really wanted to run the new McLaren in the race at Glen Canyon Raceway, and it turned out it was the faster of the two cars. My new McLaren looked awesome on the grid, and it also looked great in the podium after the race. A debut victory for the Thunderslot McLaren and the new Predator 25K ball bearing motor. Thanks everybody for watching. This is Jim Rose with NorCal Slot Car Scene. Hope you have fun building slot cars.